In many respects, North and South America are the universal models of lands crafted by immigrants. This despite emigration in the 21st century becoming almost slur words in the more developed countries of the world, including the U.S. Explorers are not in demand, except the extraterrestrial voyagers, and a significant number of immigrants again slog through almost intolerable human and natural conditions to stake a claim on new property. This global phenomenon is complex but persistent. The planet's health requires lawful and just solutions to the unsettling consequences. In the Americas, by 1800, immigration turned to emigration, an inevitable subjugation of both more land and the inhabitants of custom. The objectives of the torchbearers were not necessarily driven by less than idealistic intentions. Encounters with the newly discovered being, sometimes friendly, even inviting. But as the history of the American West demonstrates, the progress of civilization, so-called, has destructive elements alongside the constructive. Some native inhabitants were not welcoming, and there always have been less than inviting natural conditions, like mosquitoes and weather. The Lewis and Clark expedition across the western U.S. in the 1800s set the stage for a new era of human conquest. The Corps of Discovery is one of the more magnanimous stories of orderly discovery on a large scale. U.S. President Thomas Jefferson, I believe, deserves great admiration in this regard, and yet the achievement of his vision and execution of the popular unveiling of the Louisiana Territory and beyond will be forever controversial. Alexander Mackenzie's book, Voyages for short, reporting on already completed Canadian explorations from Montreal to the west in 1789 and after, was purchased by Jefferson in 1803. He apparently required Meriwether Lewis and William Clark to include a copy on their journey. But at the same time as the Corps of Discovery was winding its way across the Oregon Territory, a party of traders and voyageurs of the Northwest Company in Canada followed Mackenzie's footsteps to the Peace River, where they built a fort. The Canadians had recognized the significance of Jefferson's often pronounced ambitions and their potential impact on the fur trade and the cultivation of the Oregon Territory. And make no mistake, Jefferson and Lewis both studied the reports from Canada very carefully and even anxiously, realizing that a commercial contest was underway. Lewis was also reading the writings of Captain Cook's voyages in the Pacific Ocean. The initial phase of the Lewis and Clark expedition began near Pittsburgh and included a stop in Marietta, now Ohio, and other small settlements along the Ohio River. For this first leg of his journey, Lewis recruited 7 soldiers from the garrison station in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, a river pilot, and 3 young men who auditioned for the expedition. 2 of these men, George Shannon and John Coulter, sufficiently passed their trial period and became permanent members of the Corps. For a long time, Thomas Jefferson longed to send a military expedition into the Northwest Territory and beyond, perhaps to discover a direct water route to the Pacific Ocean. Shortly after his success in the Illinois campaign, George Rogers Clark was asked by Jefferson to lead the expedition, but he turned it down. By the time Jefferson became president, he was firm in his belief that the expedition would be a great strategic achievement, so he turned to his aide, a 29-year-old Virginian named Meriwether Lewis, 30 years younger than himself. Lewis was convinced he needed a co-commander, though, and someone he could really rely on. His choice was William Clark, a 35-year-old younger brother of George Rogers Clark, who had distinguished himself as an outstanding leader. Although born in Virginia, William Clark had spent much of his youth on the frontier. Together from the falls of the Ohio, these 2 leaders embarked on the expedition in the fall of 1803. Before Pittsburgh, Lewis had spent considerable time in Harper's Ferry in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. At Harper's Ferry, Lewis got 15 modified muzzle-loading flintlock long-barrel rifles, sometimes called Kentucky or Pennsylvania rifles. These were crucial frontier gear for food, supplies, and self-defense. An expert could get off 2 aimed shots in a minute. Meriwether also selected pipe tomahawks, knives, and additional items. Then in Lancaster, where some of the nation's finest rifle craftsmen lived, he picked up extra rifles and got schooled there by a notable mathematician and astronomer in the use of the sextant, chronometer, and other measuring instruments. His ride from Lancaster to Philadelphia took him over the most modern highway in America completed at 1795, the first gravel road in America, dubbed the Philadelphia and Lancaster Turnpike. Pittsburgh, more specifically nearby Brunot Island in the middle of the Ohio River, was Lewis's start point as co-leader of the Corps of Discovery. Lewis, with Jefferson's approval, recruited William Clark, a younger brother of the renowned George Rogers Clark of frontier fame. Dear Clark, this enterprise has been confided to me by the President, and in consequence, since the beginning of March, I have engaged in making the necessary preparations, if therefore there is anything, in this enterprise which would induce you to participate with me in its fatigues, its dangers, and its honors. Believe me, there is no man on earth with whom I should feel equal pleasure in sharing them as with yourself. Sincerely. Dear Lewis, I received by yesterday's mail your letter. The enterprise, etc., is such as I have long anticipated and am much pleased with, and as my situation in life will admit of my absence the length of time necessary, I will cheerfully join you in an official character, as mentioned in your letter. This is an undertaking freighted with many difficulties, but my friend, I do assure you that no man lives with whom I would prefer to undertake such a trip, etc., as yourself. Sincerely. In 1797, Dr. Felix Brunot, a Frenchman who had come to the continent to serve with the French army during the American Revolutionary War, arrived in Pittsburgh and purchased a farm on Brunot Island, 3 miles downstream. When Lewis and crew stopped at the island in the summer of 1803, they docked their 55-foot keelboat, and a large, elongated pirogue came ashore and greeted some apparent Freemason acquaintances. Lewis also showed off a new air gun he had purchased, supposedly to impress or intimidate indigenous Indians that might be met on the forthcoming trip west. One of the gathered friends took a turn at shooting the pseudo-weapon and accidentally grazed a woman's head. She survived okay, but Lewis and crew discreetly, and probably chagrined, packed up and headed downstream. Pittsburgh itself, until then, had been a hub and a focus of much frontier drama during the previous century. The play of conflicts and peace was funneled to the settlement here, at the point where the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers meet to form the Ohio River. Native Delaware, Shawnee, Haudenosaunee, or Iroquois Mingo, and pioneers boated from here to the Mississippi River and to the Gulf of Mexico. According to Stephen Ambrose, in 1801, when Jefferson became the nation's third president, there were roughly 5 million persons, including a majority of Negro slaves, living in the new country, and about two-thirds of them lived within 50 miles of tidewater. There were 4 main roads crossing the Appalachians, from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh, from Potomac to the Monongahela River, from Virginia southwestward to Knoxville, Tennessee, and through the Cumberland Gap into Kentucky. About 1 out of 10 persons lived west of the Appalachians, and these were, quote, the frontier breed and mildly rebellious. Lewis ordered goods for the expedition to be shipped here and waited 6 weeks at Fort Fayette for completion of the keelboat that would navigate upstream against the Missouri River current. Keelboats had a long, narrow shape, heavy wooden keel, and pointed prow. Crew used iron-tipped poles to push against the river bottom. Lewis's boat was fitted with a movable sail, and often the men had to pull the boat with rope. Lewis had arrived at Fort Fayette, central Pittsburgh, in mid-July 1803, expecting to leave again within about a week. However, the 55-foot, 10-ton keelboat, costing about $400, was unfinished at the boatyard on the outskirts of the city. The boat builder commissioned to do the job was an inveterate drunk, causing Lewis to complain to Jefferson that the man was negligent and needed to be replaced. No one else, though, could be found to do the job, so he took upon himself to regularly oversee the project himself. Lieutenant Moses Hook, at the time, recruited crew and secured supplies, and initially was considered to be candidate for Lewis's second-in-command on the Lewis and Hook expedition. As noted, Clark's co-command acceptance letter finally arrived. On August 30, 1803, the Lewis party floated toward the Mississippi without Hook. On September 6, Lewis and his small crew arrived at the settlement town of Steubenville. The settlement, Lewis noted at the time, situated on the Ohio in the state of Ohio, about 6 miles above Charlestown in Virginia and 25 above Wheeling, is a small, well-built, thriving place. It has several respectable families residing in it, 5 years since it was a wilderness. A fort built there in 1787 burned down 3 years later. At the time, Lewis purchased this famous black Newfoundland dog named Seaman at a cost of about $20, a sizable amount, which would be about $460 in 2020 dollars, but the dog too was reportedly, quote, sizable. I myself, in June 2024, tracked Lewis's movements down the Ohio from Pittsburgh, passing through Steubenville and Wheeling and some other similarly contemporary settlements like Moundsville, Marietta, and Parkersburg.